Good morning from the IEC's National Results Operational Centre in Pretoria at the Tshwane Showgrounds. My name is Pieter du Toit. I'm an assistant editor for In-Depth News, and with me is Dawie Scholtz, our resident political analyst. Good morning, Dawie. Welcome.
Morning, Pieter.
It's good seeing you. Dawie crunched the numbers overnight, looking, I want to say blurry-eyed, but he actually does not look blurry-eyed. He looks very chuffed with himself. And behind us at the back is the pit where all the results are starting to trickle in. Some results did come in overnight. Yesterday, of course, was election day, was voting day. We are now picking through the remnants of the day, and we'll be with you throughout the whole of the day, and we will be doing a couple of broadcasts with analysts, with our journalists on the ground to tell you what the latest results are. Big themes from yesterday that have emerged. Obviously, everyone is talking about a very low voting turnout number, and Dawie will talk about that quite a lot during our broadcast this morning. We are watching the ANC's performance very closely. The difference in the voting between traditional ANC strongholds and suburban voting areas is going to be another talk of the day. Johannesburg, the performance of Action SA's Herman Mashaba. But Dawie Scholtz, let's start with your general observations of yesterday. I touched on some of the big themes. What did I miss, and what do you make of voting turnout?
No, I think you got it roughly right. So I think one of the really interesting observations about this election is just turnout and you know what it means for where we are as a country. So it just seems that turnout is quite low in this election. We need to get the exact numbers. The IEC was saying it was as low as in the 30s by late last night. It potentially seems to be coming in a little bit heavier, right? We know some of their machines were off, so I think my hypothesis is their system wasn't fully covering or accounting for all of the turnout, right? And also not accounting for special votes, the day before the election. For example, I'm looking at our projection model right now for Cape Town, and it's projecting about a 46% turnout for Cape Town in this election. In 2016, the last local government election, turnout was 63%. Yeah. So that's 17% less just in Cape Town, and we see a similar trend in many of the other cities that we're starting to model, and we've got some results for. So it's down, but it's not quite as completely shockingly low.
Significant as we thought it might have been.
Yeah, but it's still very low.
So Dawie, a lot of issues that we need to unpack. I also want to talk to you about the performance of the IEC. It is under pressure for the first time that I can recall. There have been a lot of issues, consistent issues yesterday. Yeah. So that will be a big theme for the day. But let's get stuck into our first forecast. That was the big thing that we were excited about coming into these elections. Dawie, who is running our elections forecasting model. Dawie, take us through the first forecast, which was published a couple of minutes ago on News24. Let's talk about Cape Town.
Right, so Cape Town is the first one we could call. So I think it's very clear that the DA is going to win Cape Town. So we've basically projected that the DA will win. But it's also quite clear that the DA will have a reduced majority. And the number that the model is currently producing is the DA coming in at about 58% of the vote, which is down from 66% in 2016, right? So it's holding, and I think more firmly than many people anticipated. But still a relatively good result, but down, right? As I said. And there's a couple of interesting underlying things that are causing that result for the data that we have for now. The one, I think, just you mentioned it briefly, but just fundamental, critical driver of what's happening in Cape Town, and that I think is going to happen in a lot of the metros, is this just enormous, historically large, much bigger than I've ever seen, difference between suburban voters and the way they turned out and township voters and the way they turned out. So in Cape Town, for the votes we have in for now, it's still a relatively small sample, so it will become more precise as more numbers come in, but we have a very good indicative sample now upon which we've based this projection, is that of the voting stations counted, 62% of suburban voters went out to go vote. So 62, which is relatively not that high. But then you look at the same question for townships, so places like, for example, Khayelitsha, Langa in Cape Town. Turnout is 36%, 36 in those areas for the votes that have been counted. It's uncharted territory. So that's a gap of 62 versus 36. It's 26 percentage points. That's massive. In 2016, we thought it was really big when it was 15. This is more than double that size, or it's roughly double that size, which is just an incredible, and it's really impacting the election result a lot.
Before we delve into those, I wanted to delve into that. Just run us through the top line numbers for Cape Town as we are forecasting it at the moment.
Sure. So DA in the mid to high 50s, currently putting it at 57, 58. ANC around 19 or 20%. And EFF around 4 or 5%. So those are the three largest parties. And the interesting thing about Cape Town is, I think a lot of people will ask, okay, well, where did the DA's 8% go? Is it went to a lot of small parties. So Good wasn't in the mix last time, in the last local government election. They got 3% of the vote in this projection. The ACDP got 1% last time. They're 3% in this projection. The PA wasn't really in the mix last time. They're at 1.5. The Freedom Front Plus wasn't really in the mix. They're at 2 points. We still need to get clarity on exactly what the Cape Party is doing, what Al Jamaa is doing, what the Cape Coloured Congress. There's a whole host of small parties that are sort of all eating their sort of 1 or 2%, and that's causing this.
Let's take it from the top. A decline for the DA, but you say they held a little firmer than people thought they would. There was a lot of negativity surrounding the DA, especially in the last couple of days or last couple of weeks, building up to polling day. But the DA's support in Cape Town remains solid, doesn't it?
It's super interesting, Pieter, because the DA number is pretty good, but it's built on this bedrock of incredibly high differential turnout. So the DA's
Explain to us what differential turnout means. So those of us who don't understand.
That's that concept I was just explaining, where turnout is higher in suburban areas than in townships, and that's really driving their numbers up a lot. But so that's one view, right? Is just the level of turnout. But there's a different view, which is just demographically, what are the voting patterns within each of the major demographic groups in Cape Town? And this turnout effect masks a little bit of the DA's demographic losses in Cape Town, because it sort of makes the picture a little bit more positive. So with white voters, the DA lost about 7% of the vote, based on this sample we have now, compared to 2016. So they got about 94% of the vote, of the white vote in Cape Town. They're down to 86, 87. So that's 7 points. Where did it go? To the Freedom Front Plus.
That's not nothing.
That's not nothing. But as you said, holding strong, right, with their kind of core, the base in Cape Town. I think the critical variable always in Cape Town elections is coloured voters, right? And there they saw quite a significant drop. So in 2016 they had a fantastic showing. They got 79% of the coloured vote. They're down to about 61, 62, 63%.
Has that all gone to Good, you think?
No, so that's the interesting one. It's gone to Good, so Good getting about 6-7% of the coloured vote, but this is where that splintering effect is taking place. So I was explaining a moment ago about the, lots of small parties all getting a little, their little bit. That is particularly the case within the coloured electorate. So the ACDP looks like they're getting about 5%. The Patriotic Alliance looks like they're getting about 3 or 4%. Good is getting 7%. Even the EFF is getting a little bit nowadays. So it's this splintering within the coloured electorate that's causing this. And just to finish my demographic rundown, the other really critical one then, of course, is black voters, right? So as I was saying, the DA down a little bit with white voters, down a lot with coloured voters, and sort of off a very low base, staying relatively stable with black voters. So I think they got about 6%, 6.5% in 2016. They're down to 5%, so basically the same. Specifically because the sample is still small, so roughly the same, right? So it's demographic losses a little bit in the white electorate, heavily in the coloured electorate, which is why they're down. That's why they're going from 66 to 58 or 57 or whatever. But not as bad as some people thought because of this enormous disproportionate turnout that they've generated.
Dawie, let's talk about the ANC. They have not recovered from their 2006 losses. It's been going on for a good couple of years. It doesn't seem like they are recovering, and suffering further losses, and exacerbated by poor weather.
Exactly. So I think there is something to be said about the weather, right? So there was a lot of discussion yesterday about the horrible weather in Cape Town, and I think a lot of people that I was engaging with on social media was actually making the very valid point that the poor weather was going to have a disproportionate impact on people who are poorer, who are facing more difficult living conditions, who don't have a car, right? People in informal settlements, and so on.
It's much more difficult for someone in Khayelitsha to go out and vote than for someone in the northern suburbs, for example, who just needs to get into a car and drive to the local primary school.
So that definitely is I think, a very significant part of explaining why there's a 26% differential turnout. But it's got to be said, I think the ANC in the Western Cape has just, degenerated. We know over many years now, this discussion about lower and lower turnout, of the ANC base has been a discussion for a long time in the Western Cape. I was talking about the DA's demographic losses. The ANC also had losses in kind of particularly in places like Khayelitsha, the black electorate, where the EFF, went from about 5% of the electorate last time to about 15% of the electorate this time. So there's a big swing towards the EFF in those areas. So the ANC has got problems of its own in the Western Cape, and so I think, yes, the weather certainly would have affected, their ability to turn out those voters, but I think they have fundamental problems in the Western Cape also that's driving that problem. Yeah.
The EFF's interesting. It's been on the scene. It's its second municipal elections this time around.
Yeah.
So their gains are, it cannot be discounted, Dawie.
Yeah, exactly. Look, it's early days, and it's not enormous, right? So they've gone from 7 to about 14.
Yeah.
And it's still
a doubling of support.
It is a doubling of support, but it's only within one of the sub-segments in Cape Town. So I want to see a little bit more data before we get certain on that. But my sense is, yes, more. They're certainly getting more of the black vote in Cape Town.
How would the DA interpret this? I mean, they probably did expect some losses. They were under the pump. But Geordin Hill-Lewis, I thought, ran quite an adult campaign. I thought,
Yes.
it was a campaign geared towards most demographics.
Yeah.
I thought it was quite an efficient campaign.
Yeah.
You think they'd take this number and be happy with what they've got?
To be honest, I think so. Look, I think the reality is that the party's gone through a tough time across a number of dimensions. We know that the party suffered losses in 2019 already within the coloured electorate, right? So, and obviously we're comparing now to 2016.
Yeah.
And so there was sort of a kind of point in between where they already had some losses, and so I think they carried some of those losses into this election.
Yeah.
Because the fact that Pieter du Toit is no longer part of the DA, is contesting the DA in Cape Town, obviously affects the voting patterns in Cape Town. And so I think they had to contend with that. And I do think they will be relatively happy. But I will say one thing though, which is, the party has governed for how many years now? Since 2006, right? So it's 15 years now. And after 15 years, not to have made a dent in the black electorate at all, still at 5%, as I said, a point down from 2016, roughly the same as 2019. I think that will be disappointing for the party because they obviously pride themselves on delivery. That's the message, but I also actually think they believe that.
Yeah.
And delivery for all communities, right? And that particular portion of Cape Town is not voting DA.
Yeah.
And I think there has been much soul searching, but will be much more soul searching about why that's the case.
Despite the strong efforts from Helen Zille in years gone past to really move into Langa, into Khayelitsha, areas like that, Crossroads, to try and connect with people. But I do think there was a change in tone between the campaign that was run in Cape Town by the DA than the campaign that was run in the rest of the country. Patricia de Lille, happy or unhappy?
I think extremely unhappy. I can't imagine that Good would be happy with 3% of the vote and 6 or 7% of the coloured vote. I think Good never really identified any particularly resonant issues that they drove proactively, that they owned. I also think Brett Heron is a smart guy who's actually quite impressive in his own right, but demographically potentially not the right fit for Cape Town, particularly not for potential Good voters, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of Good's appeal is specifically about Patricia de Lille. I think if Patricia de Lille was running for mayor of Cape Town, it may have been a different discussion, right?
And I wonder to what extent the fact that she is in an ANC cabinet as a minister affected voters' position.
Absolutely.
I mean, when Pieter Mulder went to cabinet as a deputy minister, what was it, a decade ago? It really did affect the Freedom Front Plus's position.
Yeah, and look, the ANC got 6% of the coloured vote in Cape Town. So one of the facts about Cape Town politics and Western Cape politics, but particularly urban Western Cape, like the kind of coloured voters in Cape Town, is that the ANC brand is over many years has simply become toxic in that part of the country, right?
And they've never been able to make the transition to an opposition party.
Yeah, exactly. But the point I was about to make is, so I agree with you. The risk of joining the ANC government, was absolutely. I think I read that into these numbers. That was part of it. And the one thing that the DA did very well is they picked that fight early on in the campaign about the public land that Pieter du Toit was supposedly not making available for housing development because she's the public works minister. It was a bit of a food fight, right? But in every step of the food fight, the DA would, in every press statement, always say Pieter du Toit in the ANC's cabinet, right? And I think a lot of that was the DA simply trying to get the message out that Pieter du Toit joined the ANC voters of Cape Town. We know you don't like the ANC voters of Cape Town, and it does seem to have worked. But let us also not overpraise the DA campaign. They are down 8 points in the west, in the city of Cape Town, and if it wasn't for this historically high disproportionate turnout, the picture would have been even less good.
Dawie, one of the more fun debates, I think, ahead of the election was secession for Cape Town.
Yes.
Cape exit. What do you read in the numbers of what voters tells those parties and organisations that are propagating the secession of Cape Town?
I will give a slightly contentious answer on this, which is that I do think that there's a significant chunk of the DA vote that loves that idea, or that's at least very positively inclined towards that idea. And I'll be honest, we are having a data problem pulling in the Cape Party's numbers, so I need to get those numbers to clarify. But we know the Freedom Front Plus is a strongly secessionist party, and they're at 1.5%, right? So I would love to get the Cape numbers and then see. But I think the point I was trying to make is that this discussion about secession probably is quite popular with DA voters, and the reason why I say that is a lot of the DA campaign in Cape Town was also all about insulating Cape Town from the national government, creating distance from the national government. So I think the obvious one is trying to get power, electricity provision away from the national government.
That was a big part of Geordin Hill-Lewis's campaign.
Exactly, and it was very smart, but a lot of the language around it was protect Cape Town from the national government, create distance with national government. And for me, that was a lot about trying to talk to those voters, and I think it probably also did work. And the other thing that the secessionist parties in the Western Cape haven't really achieved is kind of reaching a level of just marginal credibility, right? Where there's a sort of tangible path towards actually being able to do that, where also just simple stuff where you can have a rally with 10,000 people or 5,000 people where you kind of look like a real party, or they clearly had a lot of money with lots of posters, but I think there's a sort of credibility gap with the secessionist movement, where a lot of voters are like, I like this idea, but I don't really see it going anywhere, and also I don't like the ANC, so I'm really worried about the ANC taking over, so I'm just going to vote DA. I think that's
morning march in Sea Point really didn't cut it as showing a show of support, massive support.
No.
Let's talk about the Freedom Front Plus as well. Just last point that I wanted to make that I remembered now on the secession movement, the DA never outright condemned or distanced themselves from it, and the Freedom Front Plus moved very close to that movement with Geordin Mulder, who's the chief whip in Parliament, often appearing on stage with the secessionists. But the Freedom Front Plus also had Leonard Max on their ticket. Doesn't seem to have really made the impact that they hoped it would.
Not really.
Amongst the coloured voters, at least.
No, not really. And look,
the gimmick then.
Yeah, exactly. So look, I think the Freedom Front Plus, 5% of the white vote in the current projection, right? Still early days. Let's see how it evolves. It's more than last time. They're up from I think 2 or 3% in the white vote, but probably a little bit disappointing for them. But the one thing is the Freedom Front Plus vote has always been a more national government vote. A lot of DA voters really want to make sure that where they can win, they win, right? Which is the case in the Western Cape. And of course, the phenomenon about the Freedom Front Plus in the last election was also, it did happen in the Western Cape a little bit, where some voters voted Freedom Front Plus, but it was a much more amplified effect in the northern parts of the country, right? So where kind of more conservative,
Yes.
more rural Afrikaans voters really voting heavily Freedom Front Plus, like it didn't happen to that extent in the Western Cape. So the foothold created in 2019 was never as strong for the Freedom Front Plus. So it kind of makes sense to me if I look at it.
Old traditional Republican voters in the northern parts of the country. Dawie, that's Cape Town. Some other trends that you observed overnight that we need to touch on in the remaining minutes that we've got left. Johannesburg, Soweto, and Herman Mashaba, the party that was established in 2019 after his very acrimonious departure from the DA, seems to be performing above expectation, doesn't it?
It's going to be an absolute cracker. So look,
we can't make projections yet. We can't say.
I would have loved to tell everyone what the result in Joburg is going to be, like the way we've done it for Cape Town, but we just don't have enough numbers yet. So we need some numbers.
And tell us what you're seeing. What do you see?
And we particularly need some IEC validated numbers that have gone through the system, right? So what we actually have a lot of is because there's party agents that share data because people are voting, counting votes, and so we've seen a lot of results being reported by party agents to us, but that have not been validated by the IEC and reported yet. And some of the results that have been reported are showing like fundamental shifts in some of the heartlands of the ANC, specifically in Johannesburg, and actually specifically in Soweto for the numbers that I've seen. There are voting districts that the ANC have never lost, that the Action SA won last night from the data that I've seen.
And that's from a base of zero.
And where the ANC vote got cut in half. So there are voting stations where the ANC got 70% in the last election. They're down to like 34, 35, and Action
remarkable.
SA is winning 38, 39, and actually winning that voting station, which is just kind of an electoral earthquake, basically.
Yeah.
We need to see the whole picture, right? So as I've said, I've also seen voting stations where Action SA only got 9 or 10% of the vote in those areas, so it balances out, and so we need to see where it balances out at. So that's the one thing, but just the one other thing about the Action SA phenomenon that must be said is I have zero data formally from the suburbs in Johannesburg, but I have anecdotal data from the suburbs in Johannesburg, and it looks like, in addition to cutting the ANC vote in half in Soweto, Action SA is also winning 20% of the white vote in places like Parkhurst, Linden, all over northern Joburg, right? And
all
even
traditional DA supporting areas.
and even winning some of those voting districts. So again, there's some where they do a little bit less good and some where they do really, really good. So we need to see where it balances out in aggregate, right? And then the other thing as well is they took a couple of wards, again, anecdotally, from the data we've gotten from the ground, in kind of predominantly Indian areas in KZN, where they actually won wards, right? So off the DA, that the DA have won traditionally. So it just, it is clearly a multiracial coalition, firstly, something that someone has not yet gotten right. But we need to see exactly where it lands up before we can kind of make a projection about it. But
so how concerned would Jessie Duarte when we see her down there at the ANC's voting or the ANC's party station in the pit down there? How worried would they be if they are looking at the same numbers as you are this morning?
Extremely concerned. So I think the chances of the ANC reaching 50% in Johannesburg are, not like non-existent, right? We don't have formal data yet, so let me not say zero. But geez, I would be very surprised if they get anywhere close to 50 in this. So I think there's going to be a coalition discussion. And geez, I would also be very surprised if they get anywhere close to their number last time, which was 44%. So and by the way, the turnout.
Sorry to interrupt, but that would signify a blowing up of politics in Joburg as we know it.
Yes, exactly. And so there's two things happening. There's an enormous portion of the ANC base not voting because for the little bit of vote we have from Joburg in the townships, turnout was 35%. Okay? And for the little bit of suburban vote we've seen in Joburg, turnout was 55-60%. So it's the same discussion as in Cape Town, massive split. Yeah. Lots of ANC voters didn't vote. And then the people who did go vote smacked the ANC. Like they vote really got smacked in places like Soweto, which has been a really strong traditional base for them. So, it's a serious discussion. But the one thing I think that will be very interesting about Action SA, which we don't know yet, there's not enough data yet, is how far does it reach outside of Johannesburg?
Okay.
Because we know Mashaba's brand is incredibly strong. We know that the two guys that were running for mayor in Ekurhuleni and Tshwane seem like great guys, seem quite competent, but no one not particularly strong brands, right? So my expectation is that the support is going to be strongly concentrated in Joburg and less in the other places, but we're going to have to wait and see. And then even in Joburg, as I've said, we've gotten tidbits of data. We need to get lots of data to understand where the averages actually are.
But the ANC's decline, which accelerated in 2016, seems to be only accelerating.
Yeah.
And what makes it more remarkable is Johannesburg, Soweto particularly,
Yeah.
is the heartland of the ANC, of the anti-apartheid struggle.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ANC won't be able to blame the weather
No.
for a low turnout in Soweto yesterday.
No, and look, the fundamental driver of this, and I think of a lot of what's going on, is in our News24 poll we did before this election, we asked the voters a question. We asked them, is South Africa on the right track or the wrong track? 70% of people, including the majority of ANC voters, said that South Africa is on the wrong track. We are going backwards as a country, including ANC people. And if you've been in government for 27 years and you're presiding over a 70% wrong track number, this is the sort of stuff which happens in a democracy. People start looking for alternatives, and people start staying away. People start looking for alternatives, and so the ANC is going to have to address this. They've got a real problem.
Vote in 2016 was a big story then. It was a big story in
Yes.
2019. It's becoming an even bigger story.
Yeah.
Load shedding over the last
Absolutely,
week. I mean,
yeah.
it has played a role. When you talk about 70% of respondents in our poll saying that they believe the country is on the wrong track, I mean, that type of thing starts adding up. Potholes,
Yes.
electricity, water, especially in a city like Johannesburg.
Yes, and look, there was a lot of sort of delivery negativity around the entire ANC campaign, from the beginning. But I really think the last 5 to 10 days of the campaign created a super negative, dangerous vortex for the ANC across a number of dimensions.
Yeah.
Obviously, the most important one was load shedding, and then a little bit of the PR mishandling around load shedding. So there were a number of stories, News24 stories that I saw, where the president, tried to explain it, and I think, amplified the vortex by saying the wrong thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was happening a lot. And the other thing about load shedding is just, it's in your face, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of voters who,
It affects you directly.
it affects you directly, and in South Africa, there's always in our media and in our politics, every week there's sort of a new mini scandal and there's a new thing to be outraged about, and it just so happened to be that the one thing to be outraged about the week before the election was the one that you could blame the ANC for, and the one that was really in your face, and the one that really reminds you and of kind of ANC failure in some way. And I think the one that a lot of people, I think, truly do blame the ANC for. I think there's a lot of issues in South Africa that people think, we have historical legacy, which is, I think, a totally fair and justified argument to make. There are all sorts of other complexities in South Africa. The ANC is trying their best. There's a lot of arguments like that to be made. With load shedding and with Eskom, I think that is the ANC owns it a bit more in the mind of the voter, from my perspective at least, which is, I think, a really, really bad issue. And then I just want to say one final thing, which I think we should not discount in the final week, is because I've worked on campaigns, I've just seen it. That 100,000 person rally that the ANC usually does on the Sunday before the election has an enormous impact on the electorate. And remember, it goes live on SABC,
galvanizes support.
And this time around, they had a rally at 7 p.m. on a Friday night that rained out. The visual wasn't great. People were annoyed about load shedding. The EFF had a great rally on the same day with better visuals. There's a bunch of stuff which sort of, death by 1,000 cuts almost for the ANC in the last week that just didn't go well. We'll see where the numbers land exactly.
Dawie, we've got a long day ahead of us. We're going to make a couple of projections during the course of the morning, hopefully. Just quickly give us a bird's eye view. You've got some insight into what's happening in Mangaung, which seems to be exciting as well. No final numbers yet, but some trends starting to emerge.
Look, this actually the same trends, not exactly, but roughly everywhere, right? So this turnout thing is explosive and it's everywhere. So really low township turnout, okay suburban turnout, massive gap, and that is driving numbers in a place like Tshwane, even in Mangaung, in a place like Nelson Mandela Bay. driving the numbers in a big way. The township numbers slightly challenging for the ANC. EFF making inroads, where the Action SA is present, Action SA making big inroads, where Action SA is not present, other parties making some inroads, and then the DA kind of holding its own by, not having catastrophic demographic losses in, any part of the country where it's competing, and also then achieving this fantastic turnout. And so all of that creates very, very interesting metro numbers in places like Nelson Mandela Bay, places like even Mangaung. We haven't got any eThekwini numbers, but I'm sure eThekwini, and of course the Gauteng metros, all three of them. So look, no projections yet, but I think the discussion will turn to coalitions quite shortly.
Dawie Scholtz, News24's election analyst. Good having you here. Thank you very much for joining me. Go get some breakfast. Please keep an eye on News24 throughout the course of the morning and the day. We will be making more projections, and we will be giving you the best coverage of this election that you can muster and find anyway. See you later.
Dankie. Ek is quite